This is French Weird. My name is Russell Williams, and I'm either saying welcome back, because maybe you've had a chance to listen to the first episode, which is where I give an overview of the types of things we're going to be thinking about as this podcast grows and develops. Or maybe I'm saying hello for the first time. Maybe you want to go back and listen to the first episode if you haven't already. It doesn't matter if you don't, you'll pick things up. If you've listened to us and you like us, by all means, share with your friends. If you want to rate us on the place you got your podcast from, that's absolutely fine. As things develop and as we move forward, I'm really keen on hearing from you. So feel free to send me an email. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you like. Let me know, hey, what you don't like as well. The email address is russell@frenchweird.com. We have a website, frenchweird.com. And that'll be a place where we will put up reading lists. We will put up information about the content of shows as we move forward and grow an archive. We're not only going to be talking about books. We will talk about books. But I'm really eager that French Weird also has a practical dimension. I'm really eager that I take my microphone out to the Paris catacombs, to the Père Lachaise cemetery, to the Forêt de Notre Dame, which is the big sprawling forest that's about 15 minutes walk away from where I'm sitting right now, which is actually where a lot of the wood for the original Notre Dame Cathedral came from. And I'm really eager to bring all reports from these visits and investigate the weirdness of these places for French Weird. So please do stay in touch. Please do subscribe to us. Please do keep an eye on this podcast, this resource, as it grows and develops. I'm really eager that French Weird is a space for discussion, a space for debate. So I'm really keen to grow a community here as well. So I'm certainly open to ideas and suggestions. Today we're going to start thinking about a writer. We're going to start thinking about a figure, the novelist Michel Houellebecq, who is a very visible, known, and maybe even notorious presence within French culture. And what I want to do with Houellebecq, who is a figure that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, is kind of unpack maybe some of the unrecognized weirdness of his work. So without further ado, we'll get going. And I hope you enjoy the episode. I want to start today by thinking about books. I want to start particularly thinking about what we might describe as the unrecognized weirdness of one of France's most significant cultural exports, one of France's most visible and high-profile cultural figures. And I'm thinking particularly of Michel Houellebecq, the contemporary French writer, who in many ways is a very controversial figure, a very much discussed figure, but a figure that I think, particularly in the English-speaking world, sometimes is what people think of when they think of a French writer. If you don't know him, Google him, you'll see he's a distinctive-looking guy, disheveled, often with a cigarette in his hand. He's notorious for his provocations, for his drinking, for his kind of media interventions. He's a very familiar face on French TV. And I think he's a weird figure in many ways, but I think there is a weirdness that I want to unpack to his writing. If we don't know Houellebecq, I wanted to spend a little bit of time kind of talking about who he is and maybe why he's significant. I'm going to refer to his books in English translations because I think maybe that's probably the easiest way to do it. He's born in 1956 or 1958. Nobody really knows. There is a little bit of mystery around when Houellebecq was born. We know he was born on the French island of La Réunion, but then kind of spent most of his life actually kind of living and working in France. Currently lives in an apartment in the 13th arrondissement of Paris. He's sometimes spotted in streets and supermarkets. And, even in the gym, there was an Instagram series of Houellebecq in the gym a couple of years back. Known for poems, started off, first made his name as a poet. And there are 2 volumes of his poetry or 2 collections of his poetry. Firstly, The Way of the Struggle, translated by Delphine Grasse and Tim Matthews, which was the first. Also a later volume called Non-Reconciled. So if you're interested in checking out his poetry, you can read it in English. Also known as an essayist, published 2 volumes of his collected essays. And early in his career in the 1990s, he spent a stint writing about contemporary culture for Les Incorruptibles, the big French kind of art and culture magazine. Essays that are worth kind of checking out. He's even also achieved kind of a certain amount of kind of critical status as a musician. I say as a musician, he has performed his poetry to musical settings, right? To musical backings, but he's done that with a number of significant kind of musical figures. I'm thinking of Bertrand Bergelat. Recently, he's worked with the musician Frédéric Lowe, who's also worked with Pete Doherty. He's performed with Jean-Louis Aubert, the big French rock star, the former lead singer of the band Telephone. He's even kind of collaborated with Iggy Pop. Iggy Pop is a big fan of Houellebecq. Houellebecq's also recorded with the composer Jean-Claude Vannier. Vannier, famous for his work with Serge Gainsbourg and Brigitte Fontaine. So he's been taken seriously by musicians, and you can buy kind of albums of him reading his poetry, but it's as a novelist and as a provocative novelist. I think that Houellebecq is probably best known. He's written 8 novels, all of which are bleak, most of which end badly. If you read a Houellebecq novel, you're more likely to be outraged, you're likely to laugh, you're likely to be challenged and provoked along the way. His first novel, Extension du domaine de la lutte, was translated in English at the end of last century as Whatever. Kind of probably made his real kind of critical name with a book translated in American English as The Elementary Particles, British English as Atomised, came out as Les Particules Élémentaires in 1998. That was probably his kind of big critical breakthrough. Also known for novels including Platform, 2010, La Carte et le Territoire, The Map and the Territory was one that he won his big kind of literary prize, the Prix Goncourt. For other books include Soumission, Submission, and most recently, his most recently one, which is a 900-page doorstop called Anéantir or Annihilation in English translation. So 8 books, most of them reasonably good. I have my favorites there. If I wanted to kind of start advising somebody, I'd say, listen, start with Whatever and then read all the way through. If you've got time to read one, my favorite is probably La Carte et le Territoire, The Map and the Territory, a novel that takes place in the Paris art world, amongst other things. So he's known for his novels. He's known for his provocations. He's also known for his media persona. I mentioned earlier that he's consistently on the television. That's probably an over-exaggeration, but he regularly gives interviews, perhaps too regularly, and he kind of assumes in some ways this position of a French intellectual, French novelist who is asked for his opinion about the way the world is going and about the way the world works. And he is regularly kind of taken seriously for his ideas on television and radio in France. And I can't think of another figure around the world in the English-speaking world, a novelist who is asked for his opinions about ideas in quite the same way. So, in some ways, he's a public intellectual in France, a country, of course, that takes public intellectuals kind of seriously in a way that maybe the English-speaking world doesn't. I can only think of a figure such as, maybe Salman Rushdie is somebody who has a similar kind of public status. I think when a writer kind of talks a lot outside of their books, there's always the critical temptation to take the author for his books. And what is the relationship of the man? What is the relationship between the man and the work, between the writer and the work? And I think, we've been told as critics that we should make a distinction between the man and the work. One of the things that I think about Houellebecq is he deliberately blurs that relationship. He makes reading a novel in a mediatized world very difficult to do, or an interesting critical challenge. So this notion of the relationship between the man and his text is really interesting. What is he preoccupied by? What do his novels speak about? Well, I'd say he primarily speaks about himself. All of his novels involve a central character, and most of them first person narrations, and that person is always an aging, disaffected, white French man who's known better days and for whom the world is not a glorious place to be, right? And arguably that, this is always kind of to a certain extent Houellebecq himself. He writes about sex. There's a lot of sex in his novels, and primarily his characters are not getting enough sex, and when they are happy enough to find sexual relationships, well, those things kind of never end in the way that we want them to, and the sex is frequently disappointing. Lots of descriptions of sex, lots of kind of passages of sex in Houellebecq's novels, and that often kind of comes across as probably more explicit than we might want. And, I've described it as kind of pathetic pornography that litters kind of Houellebecq's books. But he's not all about titillation, right? He's very much a kind of a social critic. His novels have something to say about the world, a world that we recognize, our world. But his perspective is that things are going badly. The experience of reading a Houellebecq novel is the equivalent, sometimes of of sitting in a bar, and some kind of, local depressive kind of drunk, I'll kind of idle up to you and say, I'll tell you about the way the world is going. It's kind of barroom chat. It's like it's almost like Dostoevsky's Note from the Underground, written by a kind of a French cafe boozer, right? And what's going badly? Well, why is the world turning to shit for Houellebecq? Well, it's capitalism, it's modernity. Increasingly, it's immigration, it's Islam. So this is the kind of the conservative, reactionary, right wing voices that that Houellebecq in many ways embodies. And one of the big questions about reading Houellebecq is, well, where does this come from? Does Houellebecq think this? Do his characters think this? My opinion is increasingly they're kind of one and the same. But while his novels are bleak, they're also very funny, right? There's also a kind of a dark kind of black humor to Houellebecq's books. And sometimes we're kind of left in situations about thinking, well, should I really be laughing about this? How should I be emotionally responding to it? And I think, there is something that is, that maybe in the 1990s we might have described as politically incorrect about Houellebecq's novels. And I think they do deliberately press a lot of buttons. Houellebecq is very conscious about the way that he's read. He knows that he's, that he's being kind of, challenging. He's poking the buttons. He's pressing the buttons of his readers as he moves forward. I'd say that Houellebecq's also a really stylish writer. And this is something that's often overlooked. He started off as a poet, and we do get lyricism. We do get, long, beautiful, lyrical, not quite Proustian, but still with a certain amount of elegance sentences in Houellebecq's work. We have moments where the prose breaks into poetry, where we get, the classical French refrains of iambic pentameter kind of in his work. But we also kind of get the profane, the mundane, the pornography, the kind of language of the supermarket and language of the bar. But it is this, this tension, this juxtaposition between the elegant and the banal, the elegant and the profane in a lot of Houellebecq's books. I always remember that a famous critic of Houellebecq described him as the Baudelaire of the supermarchés, right? And the first line of his first printed poem in one of his collections is "D'abord, j'ai trébuché dans un congélateur." First, I fell into the freezer, which is this kind of wonderfully elegant poem written in classical verse about a young, possibly drunk man who collapses in the supermarket, and his kind of the other shoppers are there just outraged about this kind of this guy. So it's kind of elegance meeting the ridiculousness of everyday life. So far then, so conventional, really. We've got a best-selling major French novelist that writes provocative books. Why am I yakking on about Michel Houellebecq in a podcast that calls itself French Weird? Well, the short answer is that the weird is very much the world that Houellebecq is from. And if we look closely at his novels, it's there. Right? It's there. He inhabits the world. He has emerged out of the weird. And there is a real kind of, weird sensibility in Houellebecq's novels. But this is part of the challenge of reading him, because everyone thinks they know Michel Houellebecq. Everyone's got this kind of received opinion about his work. And literary critics are, particularly academic university literary critics, are frequently pretty conservative with the way in which they might classify or categorize writers. And scholars of French literature kind of, they refer to the new by what they know, which is a standard reaction. And critics might want to put Houellebecq in a box. And in France and French fiction, it's like saying, well, he's the Baudelaire of the supermarkets, right? We have to define him by something we already know. And this often takes place within the context of the 19th century novel. 19th century novels saw, the kind of great experiments in kind of social realism. So I'm thinking about these kind of great realist novels about the likes of Émile Zola and or Balzac, which kind of really describe recognizable places and times and social movements. I think about Zola, I always think about The Drinking Den, his novel L'Assommoir, which talks, there's wonderful kind of depictions of the scourge of French society in the late 19th century, which Zola kind of thinks about in terms of the devils of drink, which is kind of wonderful kind of, bawdy depictions of bars, etc. But, it's kind of diagnosing and pointing at social problems. But Houellebecq isn't Balzac. Houellebecq isn't Zola. People frequently talk about Louis-Ferdinand Céline, the great 20th century French novelist, the writer of Voyage au bout de la nuit, Voyage to the End of the Night, and say that, that Houellebecq is a kind of reformulation of Céline. There are arguments to be made there, but, they're doing so, I think, because Céline was famously a provocateur, spent the Second World War cozying up to the Nazis, wrote some very kind of inflammatory, racist, anti-Semitic pamphlets. But Celine is a very different type of novelist to Houellebecq. Celine, a kind of very careful, attentive, flowery, elaborate kind of stylist to the extent that Houellebecq's not. But critics have this tendency to put, new writers into the box that suits them. And of course, by placing writers within literary tradition, that's a fairly understandable gesture, and it's possible, and it's valuable, and it's important. And Michel Houellebecq, of course, is very happy to be read in this way. He wants to appear in the Pléiade kind of Gallimard luxury editions of his book after he's dead. He's thinking about posterity. He wants to be compared to Zola or Balzac or Celine. Everyone's happy with that. But there's also, I think, a much more counter-literary Houellebecq here. There's a way to read Houellebecq that it isn't quite so in the thrall of literary tradition. And I think that Houellebecq as a writer, he doesn't emerge necessarily from high culture. Yeah, he might have read a lot of the kind of greats of French literature, but he emerges from popular art, from popular fiction. There was a great moment in the life of the French culture magazine, Les Inrecuptibles, probably about 10 years ago now, and Houellebecq guest edited the book section. He guest edited the whole magazine, and in the book section, the books that he'd sent out to review were all these kind of obscure examples of kind of French and American science fiction that all of the writers had never heard of before. So he's not only drawing from the top drawers of French literary culture, he's down and playing in the, in what we might dismiss as kind of literary trash. So he's into science fiction. He's into the weird. He's into the crime novels. He's into the fantasy. He's into all of this. And so if you read his works, at least two of his novels are working within the formal frame of science fiction. There was a scholar a few years ago who kind of argued that Houellebecq's most famous novel, or one of his most famous novels, Atomised, was actually kind of borrowing a frame from a novel by the American science fiction writer Clifford D. Seamack. This was a novel that was published in English as City, but was translated in French with the wonderful title of Demain les chiens, Tomorrow the Dogs, which is the anticipation of a world where humans and humanity have died out and only the dogs, I think the telepathic dogs, survive. So he's interested in this world. He's interested in the weird. And if we pick up his essays or we pick up his kind of interviews, we see his books are peppered with kind of little references to weird writers. We get the Twilight Zone writer and kind of fantastic short story teller Richard Matheson, J.G. Ballard's in there. The experimental science fiction writer Thomas Ditch is in there. We also kind of get a sustained interest in the films of David Lynch. Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me is referred to. On one of the occasions I met Houellebecq, I was prepared to kind of talk about French literature kind of with him. And this was at a conference over a drink. And he wanted to talk to me about Harry Potter, which I don't think is necessarily a great example of the world, but I think a nice example of kind of where he's coming from. He said he appreciated the simple moral universe of the Harry Potter films. I'm not sure if he's actually read the books. I'm not sure if he's a fan of J.K. Rowling. That would be another story for another day. But I think one of the big weird references, possibly the big weird reference for Houellebecq is H.P. Lovecraft. That dark master of weird fiction. But I think that's where the sustained engagement with the weird takes place in Houellebecq's work. And it's easy to forget, if we kind of get caught up in the later novels and the provocations, that actually Houellebecq's first significant publications, I'm thinking actually of a little known essay that critics don't talk about that was published in a small literary journal, La Nouvelle Revue de Paris, back in the 1980s, was a journal essay, 2 or 3 pages, about H.P. Lovecraft. That was followed up in 1991 when Houellebecq's kind of first book, Against the World, Against Life, which was his book about Houellebecq, Contre le monde, contre la vie. This did come out in English translation. It came out in 2019, translated by Dorna Khazeni, with a preface actually by none other than Stephen King. And the Houellebecq on Lovecraft book is an interesting book, even if you don't like Houellebecq's novels, right? It's a literary essay that is readable and engaging. That if we're looking for an introduction into Howard Phillips Lovecraft, his life and work, it's actually a great place to start. It's good on Lovecraft, it's good on writing, but also I think it's good on Houellebecq, right? And I read it as for the insights it gives us into kind of into Houellebecq's novels. He's interesting in this book on Lovecraft as a creator of myths, as a creator of, the genre of weird fiction. He appreciates that kind of, significant kind of role that Lovecraft kind of plays in the genre. He's interesting as well on Lovecraft's style, particularly that strange tension in Lovecraft between maybe some of the tense, serious journalistic writing and then the kind of later flights of fantasy, flights into the incredibly kind of overdeveloped, almost very difficult to read sometimes, kind of architectural descriptions of kind of fantastical palaces. And Houellebecq kind of down on the side of the role of the reader in all of this, and the emotional sense of fantasy or fascination that Lovecraft kind of creates on and in his reader in some of his greatest books. I think that Lovecraft is also celebrated in Houellebecq's writing for why we write weird fiction, why we read weird fiction. And Houellebecq identifies kind of the weird as a point of escape, a point of release from the world. He celebrates its escapism, and he identifies the weird, particularly the weird as formulated by Lovecraft, as a kind of point of escape for those who've had enough of life. Frequently a better option to suicide, and I would endorse that, reading fiction, writing fiction. But for Lovecraft, according to Houellebecq, it's this impulse to write always comes, or this impulse to write weird fiction, genre fiction, comes when you might be fed up with life, or you're displeased with life, or you're trying to kind of look for some comfort or solace. So then Lovecraft's fiction in Houellebecq's reading is a product of alienation, but also somehow opposed to life. Hence the title, Against the World, Against Life. And we can see this in Lovecraft's creatures. We can see this throughout his fiction. We see these human figures, often very conservative, exclusively conservative, 3-piece tweed suit wearing university figures who are at the mercy of these hideous, seething, non-human entities and energies. So there is a kind of alienation here. there is this opposition to humanity in the presences of Lovecraft's fiction, the entities, the Cthulhu, the kind of seething other who are about as other and as opposed to humanity as they can possibly be. Houellebecq, I think, is also interesting on Lovecraft's racism. You know, it's very well documented that H.P. Lovecraft was and very much a racist figure. We see it in some of his stories. We see it in his letters. We even see it in some of Lovecraft's poetry. And Houellebecq has a simple reading of Lovecraft's racism, which is arguably, you know, maybe too simple. Lovecraft lived most of his life in Providence, Rhode Island, a quiet, conservative, comfortable life in a very white, conservative enclave at the end of the 19th, start of the 20th century. For love, Lovecraft spent some time in New York City. He went, experienced it, hated it. Why did he hate it? Well, he hated the people. He hated the fact that there were lots of people all around him all the time. He hated the noise. He hated the hustle. He hated the bustle. He hated the commotion. He hated the black and brown skinned people, the immigrant communities that he encountered living in New York City. Now, for Houellebecq, this visceral hatred folds back into the fiction and is refracted into the monsters, the presences, this kind of visceral kind of hatred that kind of Lovecraft's field is kind of what kind of Houellebecq kind of identifies as the source or one of the sources for these monsters. Now, this is arguably a simple reading. S.T. Joshi, who is obviously one of the big experts in the Lovecraft community, has said he's kind of unconvinced by Houellebecq's reading here. But I can buy that. I don't think it's a particularly sophisticated reading, but I think there is a kind of suspicion of the world that kind of emerges through kind of Lovecraft's presences. But I'm also really interested in what Houellebecq on Lovecraft tells us about Houellebecq's own novels. And as somebody who has spent a lot of time thinking about Houellebecq, my argument is that, broadly speaking, that as a writer, we know, and we know this from the publications, that Houellebecq's early years saw him immersed in the work of H.P. Lovecraft. But my take is, even though Houellebecq has progressed out of the world of genre fiction, out of, you know, H.P. Lovecraft, and assumed this kind of high literary status, that Houellebecq's body of work is still essentially and crucially, you know, weird Lovecraftian. We can talk about even in his recent work, even in his most recent kind of, you know, novel Annihilation, Houellebecq is still Lovecraftian. And we can see this throughout his work. It is immersed. His work is immersed in Lovecraft, even today. And we see it in his poems. We see it, you know, in particularly some of Houellebecq's early poems. You know, the idea of a solitary poetic figure traveling or struggling in a strange, fantastical plane with a kind of knowledge of some looming horror that waits for him. You know, this is the fantastical Lovecraftian world that he's inhabiting here. But most interestingly is that we see the Lovecraft influence, we see the Lovecraft effect in the later novels, in the novels for which Houellebecq is celebrated. And you know, this is what we might describe as, you know, as a reformulation, a thinking through of Lovecraft in Houellebecq's writing fiction. Like I'm not saying in any way that Houellebecq is continuing the Cthulhu mythos, that he's writing about monsters or Lovecraftian in that sense, but he is concerned with weird, mysterious, devastating presences that are opposed to and working against humanity. And I think that one of the things we can say about Houellebecq, and one of the things that Houellebecq does, is that through all of his fiction and all of his work is this tension between human and anti-human forces, or human and anti-human kind of presences in some way. And I think what's interesting in Houellebecq are the forms that the human is under this kind of strange non-human pressure, and the forms that it takes, I think, is really, really interesting to think about and talk about. So we see it in 1994's whatever, or Extension du domaine de la lutte. This is a novel that talks about, a short novel worth picking up, talks about two IT support engineers who are traveling around bleak provincial France. But these are two figures who are at odds with the logic of contemporary capitalism. They feel excluded and rejected by that world. And it's almost as if that capitalism itself in this novel is the kind of Lovecraftian kind of weird, sinister force that is kind of working against them and is rejecting them. 1998's Atomised, we see it very strongly there. This is a very darkly funny novel that has for theme, or part of its theme is the history of the Western world from the 20th century, mid 20th century onwards. Again, we've got two broken characters, Michel and Bruno. Both of these characters are again broken by capitalism. There's this kind of force that is working against them. But more specifically in this book, it's capitalism has partnered with the left-wing thinking post kind of May 1968, post kind of freedom one ? To erode what Houellebecq sees or Houellebecq sees as the structures of human life and family, kind of the family unit that is being broken down for Houellebecq. So we have this, presence which is actively acting on and against the human. I think with Atomised, though, we kind of really start to see the birth or the emergence, the clear emergence of kind of, Houellebecq's kind of conservatism coming through, which would, I think, slide into reactionariness as we move forward. So all Houellebecq's novels in some way stage this kind of opposition between human characters and this kind of looming, seething threat to their existence. And it's the form that this threat takes, or as it evolves throughout Houellebecq's novels, that I find interesting. In Platform, which was published in 2001 in translation, it's the corruption of sexual economy, or it's the creation of a libidinal sexual economy based on exchange. We see it kind of, reformulated later in 2015's Submission. But in Submission, it's actually, religion. It's specifically Islam that becomes the enemy, right? Becomes the force that is looking to take over France and perhaps the Western world. But we're getting to the heart, I think, here of one of the things that makes Houellebecq kind of problematic. And that is the conservative drift in his work that I mentioned a second ago. And this kind of is kind of enhanced or doubled down by the fact that, and I mentioned this kind of problem at the very start, it's by Houellebecq's media persona. And so it is increasingly difficult to say, well, this is what the novels think. This is Houellebecq is inhabiting here the space of literature. He's using the novel to explore these ideas. He might not really think it. And I think there have been so many media interviews where Houellebecq has spoken outside of the novels when it kind of becomes clear that, well, Houellebecq is suspicious of Islam. He's a critic of Islam. He's been prosecuted there was an attempted prosecution for comments he made in an interview when he was accused of inciting racial hatred. He was eventually let off, but a critique of Islam, a very vigorous critique of Islam, has been something that has been consistent throughout Houellebecq's career. So it appears that there's less this isn't about the free play of ideas in the space of literature. This is, kind of Houellebecq expressing increasingly as his career goes on, a viewpoint. So this is kind of where I'm coming from with this idea of the weirdness of Houellebecq, this tension, this texture that comes across throughout his work. There's also more weirdness in Houellebecq in slightly different ways. I'm thinking stylistically, building on the tensions in Lovecraft style. We spoke about the tension between the stylish experimentation, the floweriness, and the kind of more kind of sparse prose. And we get that in Houellebecq's writing too, right? Houellebecq kind of frequently is rooted in the language of the barroom and the supermarket and advertising, but then it'll go off into these kind of lyrical, dreamlike passages that do have this kind of very strange, enchanting even effect on the reader. So I've been thinking about the weird in Houellebecq, and I was delighted or a little bit terrified to see Houellebecq's last novel, Annihilation, which came out in 2022, which is an 800-page, doorstop of a book. In my opinion, could probably have done with a little bit of editing. It's a very flabby book, but it's also tremendously weird. It's probably his bleakest book. It's a book that speaks about, death and illness and things getting worse. And in a way that is kind of weirdly without a lot of the humor that we've seen elsewhere in Houellebecq's book. So it's pretty hard going. And death as a subject is quite a weird subject in many ways. But it also has these kind of really distinctive kind of like weird subplots. There's a whole strand about one of the characters' wives really getting into Wicca. And there are quotes from kind of like Wicca self-help books, etc. So he's interested in these kind of, alternative, weird thinking, weird religion. There's a whole subplot that featured kind of strange band of what appear to be heavy metal obsessed satanic kind of anti-capitalist terrorists, which is odd. Never kind of really makes a kind of full resolution in the book. It's also a book that is weird in form. For the first time in his career, Houellebecq has experimented with images in the novel. And these feature kind of strange, kind of esoteric scribbles that maybe come from the hand of Houellebecq himself. It's kind of really unclear what these are, and they're never really kind of, again, reconciled away in the book. They're very strange. And then the first time I opened this book, the first thing I saw was a full-page picture of Eliphas Lévy, the 19th century French occultist's famous image of the Baphomet. Now, by all means, go Google the Baphomet. This is a horned beast with breasts and a penis. It's not really clear what this is doing in Houellebecq's book, but weird it is, and it is absolutely certainly there. So I've come for I'm not going to say a site visit or a field trip or anything as grand as that, but I've come to walk outside my house, partly because I want to investigate using this kind of new remote microphone, partly because I also want to make sure that it works and give you a slightly different kind of background noise. It's not that the neighborhood in which I live is particularly weird or strange, although we do have our suspicion about a few of the neighbors. I guess I wanted to thank you for listening to this episode. Hopefully you've made it this far. That isn't a kind of looming Lovecraftian being in the background. That's a plane, holidaymakers either arriving in Paris into Orly Airport, likely. Hopefully you can still hear me despite it. I wanted to thank you for listening to the exploration today of Michel Houellebecq. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you found it enjoyable. I hope the aeroplane hasn't been too annoying or off-putting for you. Please do feel free to subscribe, to keep in touch, to share, and by all means send me a note at russell@frenchweird.com. I'll be back soon. I have lots up my sleeve. I look forward to getting them down and sharing them with you. Have a nice rest of the day. This has been fun. This has been French Weird. More soon.